Good evening, everyone. It's great to be here again. Welcome to the Nairametrics X Spaces. Today's town hall session. My name is Wadi Ahime. I will be your host today, and Faith will be joining me as co-host as we go on. Um, I just need to explain what we're going to do and how we're going to go about the town hall today, so that nobody thinks or feels that they are left out of the discussion. Last week we spoke at great length about the windfall tax in Nigeria. Is it a catalyst for economic growth, or are we just seeing another situation whereby another set of taxes are going to be imposed on one of the sectors of the economy? Some of the things that we heard last week were the fact that yes, it is a tax that people believe that should go. It's not new to the global economic world. It's happened in the UK. It happened in the 90s. It's happened in Italy. It's happened in India. It's happened in some parts of Asia. So, but um, the general modus operandi, or the general feeling, is yes, the tax might be necessary, but the major questions that came out of it were: are we sure that it's going to be used in the right direction? What areas are we going to look at it? What areas are these taxes going to be spent on? And so that's what we'll be talking about more today. Today we'll let a number of our listeners speak to that. But please, there are some ground rules. Um, we'll start off with speaking with one of the speakers, and taking like a summary of what we spoke about last week, and just sharing their perspective again quickly so that people get an idea. But for those in the town hall, when we pass the microphone around, you'll have a maximum of 2 minutes to express what you want to say. But please, let's restrict ourselves to the fact that what we want to find out is which areas are we looking at that this windfall tax should actually go into. Not about whether the government is going to collect it or not, but if the government, there's a bill that's already in effect, there's an act already in effect to that. So it's just the timing and what areas are we going to look at it that we're going to be spending this money, and what is the message in town, so that the government is listening and listening to Nigerians, so that they have a better idea of saying, and what kind of specifics are we going to be looking at. So in the next 2 minutes we'll come back. Thank you for joining us, um, Dr. D. We would have a brief conversation based on the highlights from last week, as we await two other speakers. So you will kick off, and then once we get that on, then we'll open the mics to the town hall for the first three sets of people who would speak to what we had discussed last week, and which areas, and what are their own perceptions about how that tax should be used. So we'll be back in the next 2 minutes, and so that we give some other people an opportunity to join in the session. Thank you very much, and welcome once again to the Nairametrics X Spaces Town Hall: Windfall Tax in Nigeria, a Catalyst for Economic Growth. Welcome back, everyone. I can still see some people are joining, so maybe we'll just give them another 3 minutes so that we start at exactly 10 minutes past 6. The session should last about an hour, maximum an hour 20 minutes, and by 7:30 we should be done. Thank you very much again. Okay, good evening once again, and welcome back to Nairametrics X Spaces Windfall Tax in Nigeria, a Catholics for Economic Growth Day Town Hall. So, the ground rules for the Town Hall is I would speak with our speaker for the next 2 to 3 minutes, and then we would open up the mic. So, if you want to speak, and contribute to it, please kindly just make a request, and then I will at every segment I would call on 2 or 3 people, so who will give us a feedback on what they think and how they think the taxes should be used and their own expectations in terms of that. Please, let's be civil, and create an atmosphere where people are going to be able to speak to the authorities towards better understanding that these are the things that we expect the windfall tax to be used for. So, good evening, Dr. Yu. I would like you to introduce yourself quickly so that we can get into the session.
Yes, thank you very much. I hope I'm audible. Over there, am I audible?
Yes, you are. Good evening.
Okay, good evening. Yes, good evening to everyone on the platform. My name is Udo. I'm an agronomist by profession and a public policy analyst. So I think that is it about me. And I want to thank Nairametrics for always providing the platform. I mean, it's always a pleasure to be here to discuss on topical issues. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. You were part of the discussant last week, and a number of the things that came out, and we already know the bill was submitted um as part of the 2023 Finance Act amendment. The Senate increased it from 50% to 70%. Um, we know that windfall taxes happen across other parts of the world. It happened in Italy after COVID. A number of countries did do some form of windfall taxes, even in Africa. But when you consider all this, so what are your specific thoughts in terms of how we in Nigeria can go about implementing this before we open the microphone to the audience? Dr. DU.
Okay, thank you very much once again, Wade. The windfall tax from the report that we saw in the media was supposed to specifically tax unusual high profits that the banks, was making from the activities in the forex market. And I think from the bill is supposed to start from, it's supposed to be applied retroactively from July. Okay. And this is not a tax that is directed at the banks for some special banking ingenuity on their side. This is just monies that they are making, from the banking side of selling forex, making huge profit from it. So the government were requesting for 50% of that profit. But when the bill got to the Senate actually raised it to 70%. That the government should actually get 70%, which I am in support of that. I don't feel it should have been higher, but 70% is a fair starting point. And then the government, on their part, said that this money is to help them fund capital projects, critical infrastructure projects, and also they mentioned two sectors they wanted the money to go into, which was healthcare and education. These are, I think, two critical sectors of the economy that deserves improved funding. As I'm speaking to you right now, the 2024 budget that was allocated for the education sector was 2.18 trillion naira out of the 27.5 trillion naira budget. The initial budget was 24 and the Senate increased 27. And that represents 7.8%, about 7% of the total budget. And this still falls significantly below the UNESCO recommended 26% of national budget specifically for education. They recommend that national budget should allocate at least 26% of his budget. And out of this money from the report, we understand that the Federal Ministry of Education was to get 1.23 trillion, and the third fund was to get 700. So it shows that the government still is underfunding the educational sector of the country. And this is not particularly only about this administration. It is a recurring decimal in the country that the educational sectors, healthcare, has always suffered underfunding. Okay. And these are basic necessities, of empowering the citizens, because it is, at least basic education is a right of every child in Nigeria to have access to basic education and healthcare. So I want to, first of all, I think on the surface, acknowledge and commend the government for having it, in its plan, in its policy plan, fiscal policy plan, to um, crawl this profit from the bank and then use it to fund the education sector. So I think the conversation, like you have said in the ground rule, is to dissect and scrutinize and see how this money is going to be spent judiciously, at least if the money can be allocated and used to fund these sectors that the government have identified that are critical sectors, that needs this funding. Then I think we should commend them. I think it should be a commendable thing. Then that is would be my opening remark. I think also the words that the government used, even the social and political analysts used to describe this tax as a way of promoting economic justice in the country, because in a country with huge inequality gaps between the rich and the poor, and the bank is making this sort of huge profits, it is wise that they pay their own fair share of tax, to help fund infrastructures that they also will have the benefit from, right? From road infrastructure securities to secure them as well, legal, legal frameworks that will help them also to recover maybe loans, delinquent loans that they might have given out. So there's a lot of things that this is going to address, apart from income inequality, and also help for economic stability and prosperity. So I think I will leave it at that for now. Over to you, Wade.
Thank you, Dr. Du. So we've heard. We're going to open the mics now. So if you really want to say something about Dr. D's opening remarks, his focus, he says, he's focused on two areas that the government have said that they're going to deploy some of these resources into, which is healthcare and education. We've heard that the basic United Nations expectations for education, for instance, is about 26%. I think healthcare is about 20% of budget. And we do know that Nigeria over the last um 30, 40 years has really not been able to do that. And so my question, and just to keep the discussion going, will be, which areas are we going to be looking at it? Is it to pay for the lecturers in tertiary universities so that we can increase their salaries in education? Is it to improve the infrastructure, and create new ways of learning? For healthcare, is it build new infrastructure, what's it called, teaching hospitals for some of our tertiary universities, or specialist hospitals, as the case may be, or just even provide equipment, modern day equipment? So I'll open the floor, and my technical team at the back, if you see the request, please, let's bring them on. And I see Habu and I don't think I really can't see that, but there are two requests there. So let's bring them on so that we can hear them. But let's remember, the ground rules is we're speaking to which areas we're looking at, and how the government can actually deploy this 70% windfall tax that is expected to be collected from banks. So let's start with Habu, please. Please, could you bring him on? Okay, while I wait for my team at the back to sort themselves out, let me welcome Orekelewa, who is our other speaker, who was also here with us last week, and let's take another aspect of the issues that were discussed last week, towards looking at which other areas where we should also be focusing on, and what kind of things we're going to be talking about. Orekelewa, good evening. Could you just quickly introduce yourself, and then I'll take the next question, and then we'll go on and go back to see whether we can get some of our speakers on.
Hi, Wade. Hello, guys. I'm Orikiloa. I'm a consultant, researcher, academic. Um, I just wanted to kind of like give a little bit of a framing remark. I think there are two aspects to this, right? The first is, of course, the specific areas that we want the government to invest in, though there are some structural issues at play, right? So, for example, if we think about something like healthcare, we're not meeting up to our kind of international benchmarks for healthcare spending. But one of the primary reasons for that, and the fact that, we wouldn't have for example, childhood immunization program if it wasn't for international aid, is because of the constitutional position of health. It's like on the residual list, and as a consequence of that, you have um, difficulty in terms of tracking and streamlining spending across the three tiers of government who are responsible for different aspects of it, right? That being said, I think that it is very important in this moment, especially because the windfall tax has been introduced on the grounds of equity and creating a fairer, more just economy, that much of this spending goes towards the development of human capital, both on the health side, also on the education side. but also towards creating new prospects and opportunities for citizens. You know, it's a really challenging time for people. I think there's another kind of less focused on aspect, or less kind of treated aspect, which is the fact that at present, the existential threat to all of this stuff, to all government spending, is the challenges that the economy is facing at the moment and the success of the reform program overall. Um, and I think it's very important that we kind of balance the specific demands in terms of capital expenditure with a more holistic perspective in terms of the government actually being able to deliver on its basic premises. And I think I mentioned this in the previous session last week, that, you know, what we're seeing, especially across the MDAs, is really, really poor budget performance. I'm seeing MDAs as of August with budget performance of 7%, 6%. Now, hopefully this means that more spending is targeted, but in reality that means that many of these organizations are just paying for salaries and not much else. And so I think it would be interesting to kind of think through what what ways can the government use existing structures, because there's a tendency to create new things, right? We'll get a new investment vehicle, or we'll get renewed hope homes, or we'll get, you know, a new kind of program on education. I think it would be interesting to see or have a conversation about what existing vehicles are there within the government infrastructure that we could channel funding through, or where do we think that funding is not is missing. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Rekelewa. While my team is still working out their technical issues, let's go to the second part of our discussion. Dr. D has spoken about the fact that there's health and education, and he also mentioned the fact that one of the reasons for wanting to go about this windfall tax is to ensure economic to address economic inequality and wealth redistribution, and also looking at the banking sector's role and responsibility in supporting the current economic climate that we're in. So when you consider all this, and you consider the fact that there is recapitalization coming in, and so on, do you think that in taking out these windfall taxes, we will be able to get enough towards supporting infrastructure, capital infrastructure, health, education, and poverty alleviation?
Well, I think there's, let's take, for example, infrastructure, right? There are two ways to look at infrastructure. You have the big ticket infrastructure, right? Major roads being developed, if you're thinking from the federal perspective, right? So federal government is responsible for interstate roads, right? So major roads being developed, ports, all of those kinds of things that develop our capacity to do trade, to transport goods and people around the country. I think there's a less kind of thought about aspect of infrastructure, which is the kind of um, supporting infrastructure for trade. So if we think about the environment that we have at the moment, and also putting that in the context of the pressures on banks with the recapitalization exercise, one of the knock-on impacts of the tight monetary environment is that cost of borrowing for businesses, especially small and medium businesses, is going through the roof, right? And I think that one thing that the government could invest in is infrastructure that allows for lower cost loans through the traditional banking institutions rather than through fintechs, channeled towards specifically small and medium enterprises in high priority sectors. Um, I think in addition to that, if we're thinking about, like, if we're going to be able to get enough, you know, the infrastructure gap in Nigeria, I believe, is estimated somewhere around the region of $2 trillion, right? So it's highly unlikely that we'll be able to, given the results that banks posted last year, and bearing in mind that this only applies to realized gains, not unrealized gains, um, the likelihood that we'll be able to, you know, fund two or three major roads from this windfall tax alone is unlikely. However, the point is that when government is supposed to have the seed and then bring the private sector along in various different aspects, whether that's through PPP, whether that's through like investing in already existing private initiatives. providing funding guarantees or some of the other supporting financing infrastructure to be able to make more out of that tiny seed, right? So I think the question is not whether, we're going to have like a, I don't know, super highway or coastal highway funded directly from this, because I think that Nigerians don't really have the appetite for that anyway. I think it's more so about how the government is going to be able to amplify and create a multiplier effect through this form of investment. So it's going to have to really sit back. I think it's very easy to want to kind of do loads of ribbon cutting and say, oh, we'll build some extra schools or we'll build some extra departments, or there's a plan at the moment to kind of turn some of the federal hospitals into more specialist institutions. But I think we also need to think more long term, given that this is a one-off tax, about how we're going to be able to make it a sustainable investment. It's no use saying this year we're going to spend loads of extra money, but not being able to replicate that in future years. So I think we probably would, I would rather see this maybe invested through the NSIA stabilization fund, or the I can't remember what it's called, the future fund is like essentially. But I'd rather see it invested in a way that isn't from like direct payment to contractors, but actually a vehicle that would yield returns and be bankable for Nigeria.
Thank you, Rekilewa. Uh, so let me bring on Jab. So you've heard our speakers, and we're trying to open the floor to the town hall, and get more people to speak. So you heard Dr. D speak about healthcare and education in terms of where we expect those kind of fundings to go into, and what the federal government has already said. And so, what specific things do you think we should be looking at in terms of healthcare and education? And you heard Orikulewa's position of, let's not try and get to the fact that we need about 20 between 20 and 26%. But what kind of things that would help stimulate the economy in terms of areas of education and healthcare towards ensuring that we can see the ripple effect across board. Thank you.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. I think Oriklewa has said a lot about what the government can possibly do with the windfall tax. But my own concern is that, please, can you verify that you can hear me loud and clear?
I can hear you, but let's remember that we're trying to get specific things that we want to get out so that the government is aware of what we're saying,
Okay.
not just what's it called. So that's why we're specific about people speaking to the aspects of where we think the government should start looking at, or how quickly, when they're applying this, what they should be looking at, please. Thank you.
Okay. So thank you very much. So what I think the government can look at with the realized gain from the um, windfall tax is to look at major consumptions by Nigerians. And when I say major consumptions, I'm talking about food. Um, with the current fuel price that has gone up now, I think government need to look at how to subsidize consumption so that people consumption power can go up a little bit. Maybe provide infrastructures for farmers, or just bring a long-term plan. And my own what I'm skeptical about basically is this realized gain is not eventually being looted by the corrupt politicians that we have. So if it is not, we should have a long-term plan. Let's not say that the realized gain is going to be used for healthcare, agriculture, or unemployment. Let's focus on one particular thing, do one particular thing and do it well. If we want to use it for boosting our agriculture in order for us to be able to generate more food stuff for the economy, and for us to be able to, be able to provide food for the whole economy, good and well fine. If we want to focus on education, let's properly invest it in education and let the process be transparent and let everybody accountable, because a lot of manufacturing companies are going to be declaring a huge amount of loss this year because of the impact that this is having on the industry. So I think it's either we focus on food or we focus on agriculture. So that's just my own contribution. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jab. And so I hear you. So Jab is specific about let's focus on agriculture, and if we're focusing on agriculture, we should work out what we think our long term expectations will be, so that when we start to create that impact, we're not just thinking about, like Morikelewa said, just having that windfall and saying we're doing this, and let's have specifics in terms of how we build up and ramp up the investment in this area. So let me go on to Dieter, please. Could you come on and and um and give us your own perspective, especially when it concerns the fact that, remember that Orekelewa has said something about work, working on major infrastructure, like logistics infrastructure and target infrastructure development, so that it can create socio-economic activities towards improving wealth and all. Thank you very much. I think we've lost him.
Hello.
While we're waiting for,
Yeah,
let me. Oh, okay, so CO2, go on, please. Go
okay,
on,
okay.
please.
My position on the wind portal is like, why is it now? Because this will necessarily deplete the like the cash, the liquidity of the banks, and there is a capitalization that is upcoming. And these banks, they really need a huge amount of cash to be able to meet up. And with this burden on them, they'll be able to achieve that. And in the history of these countries, when the capitalization takes place, banks needs to match or acquisition takes place for them to be able to resist the shock that comes with capitalization. So I think it's the time with our economy. I don't think the banks will have huge profit like they declared last year by the end of this year, to my own knowledge, if I should be right. I think it is the wrong timing, and there's never been any accountability in this country and transparency when it comes to the usage of tax. So how are we very sure that they will use it at the end of the day for what's it called? The education and infrastructures, I mean healthcare infrastructures.
Thank you very much. Kelvin, welcome. It's great to have you on the session. I think I would like to bring you on so that but first, quickly introduce yourself so that we'll know who you are, and
Okay,
then we'll take up the next theme.
okay,
Hi, good evening. Hi, thank you so much for having me. How do I introduce myself? Well, I'm in between roles. I consult for government, I also consult for the private sector. I think that's the shorthand version for now. Thank you so much.
And who better to have one who sees both sides of the coin and is able to appreciate the intricacies of it. We're talking about the windfall tax, and we're trying to. Last week we did talk a lot, and some of the things that came out were about banks speculative. I hope you can all hear me. Bank speculative activities and moral responsibility from a sustainable perspective, and also the fact that with all the things going on in terms of bank recapitalization, foreign investments, and policy consistency, what do you think, in your own opinion, um, would investors be looking at in terms of this, and how do you think that could affect the fact that this windfall tax, people might be looking at it and saying, okay, even if you take it, will investors be willing to put monies into the bank as recapitalization is coming in? And then secondly, when you look at government performance and policy implementation, is it just going to be another tax that is going to bring in money and is not going to be used in the right places? We've heard Dr. D and Orekelewa talk about you putting it into health, into education, into strategic infrastructure development. So, what are your thoughts before we go back to the town hall?
And thank you so much. So I'll take you back to Q1 of 2024 when the CBN sent the circular to the banks and had mentioned to them that they should not spend the whatever paper profits they've booked from revaluation gains on FX forwards. And my thought when I saw that circular to the banks was that, okay, you know what, they were going to apply it to, because I was expecting recapitalization to be announced. They were going to apply it to recapitalization for the banks. It was surprising and a good development when they announced recapitalization and specifically told the banks that they were not allowed to use revaluation gains from FX forwards to recapitalize and balance their gearing ratios. And then after the banks closed their tax returns, their 2023 financial year, and taxes were paid, all of a sudden, an emergency, this thing was sent to National Assembly. The proposal from the executive was actually 50%, and then the National Assembly, in their wisdom, raised to 70%, just like that. When it comes to windfall taxes, there are usually processes. You don't just wake up in the morning and say you want to apply windfall tax, because you're also sending a negative signal to the international community that there is no consistency in policy making. You know, apart from the fact that it's retroactive, and the reason why they say it's retroactive is because you're applying it to a previous financial year where companies have finished their annual, assessment, and they've, closed, paid taxes and all of that stuff. There was no technical consulting session done for tax policy costing. That's what it's called. The tax people will tell you it's called tax policy consulting. Banks were just taking all of a sudden, like, at the time when they are raising money to, raise. Now, I'll tell you why it's good. The recapitalization is very good. 10 years ago, Tier 1 banking license at 50 billion was about over 300 million US dollars. Tier 2 was half of that, about 150 or 170 million dollars. And then, you have the devaluation of the naira dropped about 95%. And the same 50 billion naira is now less than 30 million dollars. So the need to recapitalize the banks was imminent and it was important. I think it's one of the most important things that the central bank will do for this current decade that we're in. Because you need strong banks with very good gearing ratios to be able to attract institutional capital. It's very, very critical and important to do that. But for you to apply a revaluation, what's it called, windfall tax, considering that in fact not all the banks had closed their open positions, some still have floating positions, presents legal issues. You've seen the statement from the Bank Directors Association of Nigeria, BIDA, and released a statement. I think that is also going to suffice for the Bankers Committee speaking. I'm not sure they want to challenge the central bank directly because of how sensitive it is. So apart from, the money is going to come and help government do this and do that, I think the question I've asked in meetings privately is, so in 2026 financial year, how is the government going to raise the money, for example, to cover for the shortfall that's presented in the increase from minimum wage from 30,000 to 70,000? Are they going to apply another windfall tax? Or where's the money going to come from exactly? So the thinking behind, oh, you're going to use the money for this, for that, because already nearly 70% of your budget goes to servicing debt and doing under recovery. The government has said it's not in their budget. But the reason why that is clever by half is because whether you put it as a line item in your budget expense or not, the cash cow that brings you revenue to pay the line expense of under recovery on PMS is NMPC. And if you don't put it, and they have to capture it as FX differential, the revenue was supposed to pay you as dividends to cover that line item. They're still going to take it from there, which is what you've seen play out currently with NNPC. So before we even go into the benefits of the windfall tax, the monies that will come to the government, let's consider that the very concept of applying a retroactive tax on the banking sector at a time when they are going through a recapitalization exercise, which is the biggest event of the decade for the banking industry in Nigeria, is completely off. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. So what I hear you say, in terms of your summary, and correct me if I'm wrong, Orekelewa, I'll come to you shortly. What I hear you say is investor confidence. Is it going to be very strong? What are the effects on bank capitalization? And we can see that because they can't use their retained earnings as part of what will go into their capital, like it was done in 2005. And then the last aspect is legal issues. So even if we want to know from those in the audience where we want to spend them on, whether it's major logistic infrastructure or targeted infrastructure development or healthcare, healthcare and education, there is a carrot dangling above our heads as it relates to those three areas. So let me come back to you, Orekelewa. Before I'll come to you, Dr. Victor. Let me come to you, Orekelewa. So when you consider all this, I hear everybody say windfall tax is important, is good, it's been done. I hear Kevin say, oh, it hasn't been thought through. Well, it has been thought through, but there are other things that you didn't touch base with the other side. So, what are the expectations from you? It's going to happen. It's part of the law. You've said the areas that you want it to come into, but what are your own expectations? Because these are critical issues that Kevin has raised: investor confidence, effect on bank recapitalization, open positions, legal issues on them. How do we deal with all that?
E- Okay, so I think there's a corollary to American exceptionalism. There's a tendency whenever we think about Nigerian government policy to exceptionalize Nigeria. I think it's important, as I kind of outlined last week, to recognize that, especially since 2020, there's been a series of windfall taxes imposed. These are retrospective in nature, of course, but there have been a series of windfall taxes imposed across the globe. At the moment, almost two-thirds of European countries have imposed a windfall tax on the energy sector, for example, who benefited from the rise in energy prices as a result of the sanctions placed on Russia during the Russia-Ukraine war, right? Now, the reason for imposing a windfall tax, and it's very important to note this, is that in capitalism, we're told, when you have the incentive of profit, then you create companies that are innovative, that strive to provide operational excellence in order to be able to maximize their profits. But if you get a sector which benefits to the detriment of other sectors, it's very important. The monies that banks have been able to make are have a dotted line drawn from them right the way to the manufacturing sector losses, right? There are loans that manufacturers are repaying at higher rates, are the loans that they're repaying to banks, right? So it's very important to kind of put that into the mix. Now, the question is, as a country, when we're thinking about our trajectory for development, is our priority production or is our priority financialism? And I think our priority should be production. And so I think that ultimately the financial conduit, that's the banking sector, should not be the biggest beneficiary of government policy, but also should contribute to the development of productive organs, because ultimately that's what allows it to sustain itself. And I think that's the reason why many leading figures in the banking sector have come out in support of the windfall tax, because I think they recognize the unique role that the financial sector plays in the overall economy. I think the second thing to kind of put on the table is, I don't think that, bearing in mind some of the conversations that have happened since and statements that have been made, I don't think there was ever I think people were surprised that banks weren't able to use retained earnings for the recapitalization exercise. And whilst banks have been somewhat lazy in terms of all issuing rights as a means of recapitalization, I think the CBN was quite, uh, um, uh, forward or assertive in asking banks to look to financing and for their recapitalization from abroad, right? And so what part of it was also to try to integrate our financial sector, our banking sector better with the global economy. I think the final thing to kind of say on this is that when we um, when we kind of draw up the social contract, ultimately it's an exchange of power. The people give their power to the government to govern over them. Now we can have quibbles about the degree to which Nigeria's democracy has developed, or the degree to which Nigeria's democracy is truly reflective of the will of the people, even just on a demographic basis, right? However, however, primarily it is the function of government, with the interests of all Nigerians at heart, to set policy which allows for the development of the economy overall. I think then, therefore, when we're thinking about, some of the other things that have been raised in terms of potentially, discouraging foreign investors, what happened last year was a unique event. I don't think we're going to have another flotation, because I hope we never go back to fixing the naira. And so investors are aware that the gains that banks had in 2023 are not going to be replicated again. Certainly not in the same way, and certainly not with as much ease, right? And so then we have to kind of think, now that we're in this situation, now that the economy is facing challenges on multiple fronts and also is situated within a challenging global macroeconomic environment, then we have to think about, okay, well, what is the best way forward in terms of ensuring that in this period of flux, we don't fall back in terms of education, we don't fall back in terms of health, because we were already starting on, negative 20, compared to where we should be. But also, how are we going to ensure the ability of the government to post these, to fulfill these reforms? Now, it's important also to note, as someone said, many of our biggest taxpayers are posting losses at the moment. Government revenues are far below where they should be at this point in the year. And as I mentioned before, budget performance is really low. And so we can't keep asking government for things. We can't keep asking for subsidies on consumption without a correlating plan for how we're going to finance those. And at this point in time, when you have economic crisis, difficult decisions have to be made. I think at the very least in this situation, we haven't seen a kind of massive, uproar from the banking sector, because I think they're on board with the government's program. And so I'm not really sure why we should necessarily oppose this. I'll leave it there.
I don't hear an opposition, Morekilewa. Everyone is just stating their concerns as it relates to the different aspects of the economy that we're talking about. And I think what Kevin was trying to bring out to focus was investor confidence. And like you said, if at the end of the day you're asking banks to integrate more globally and more internationally towards getting recapitalization from foreign investors, then foreign investors also have to take a step back and be sure that what kind of policies are they going to be dealing with, and I think we just rest at that. But let me bring in Dr. Victor, and you've heard all the things that have been said, and the feedback from those within the town hall, speaking about the areas and the things we want to do, and the concerns that our speakers have have shared as it relates to where it should go into, how they think it should it should be executed in terms of that. So for me, and then we've heard Kevin also speak about the confidence of investors, issues of bank recapitalization. For you, as someone who is listening, what is your feedback to the government in terms of this thing? This windfall tax is here to stay. However, in implementing this and all these issues, let me not call them issues, all these areas that are challenging for the resources to come to, how do we go about it, and which area specifically, or which area specifically are you going to use? Are you going to put in these resources towards ensuring that, one, there is a spiral effect in the economy?
Well, thank you very much. I'm afraid I'm going to be approaching this uh, rather differently than what we've been talking about. When I first heard about the windfall tax, um, from what I've heard from other speakers, it's like I'm not sure we're really listening when was it the finance minister or who that was talking. Um, what is happening here? And I'm not speaking to government, rather, I want to speak to us. What the government is doing right now, I think we're in a very desperate situation right now where government is trying to raise money by every means necessary or every means possible. And the idea behind the windfall tax is like saying, now let me put it in very, very, I don't want to say use street language or whatever, but let me just put it a very crude way. You know what they call it over invoicing for contracts, where you go and then somebody says, okay, increase the money. The road contract is probably 1 billion, and I say make it 2 billion. And then later I go back and say, give me the 1 billion on top, you can keep your 1 billion. What I see is, when this came about, it was because of Forex. They raised, when the foreign exchange just went over the roof, it's like, okay, the banks are the ones making all the gains and they're keeping all this money. Now let's have our share. Whether I don't know if anybody really listened when Edun was talking, but frankly, government is interested in the profits that the banks have made as a result of their policies. It's saying, guys, you can't keep this money alone. You keep declaring fat profits anyway. Every year, and these profits, as a result, we made it possible for you. Now let's have our share. That's where it is. Now let me tell you where my own concern is. My concern is that governments may therefore look at this as another form of revenue generation or taxation, or we call it taxation, right? Another form of revenue generation. And so they can, like you would do in the stock market or in Forex or whatever, where you have a certain group of people manipulating the market, whether to go up or down for their personal gains. This is exactly what I see government doing. I don't know if anybody is seeing it or if anybody has seen through that, but I can assure it has come to stay, and it's not necessarily in the interest of the common man. Of course, money will be deployed to do, infrastructural projects and all other things that governments normally do. But for me, the motive, let me use street language, is not pure, and that's my worry. I may not be staying too long after this because I have a meeting at 7 Zoom time, but let me just yield the mic at this point and then hear what others have to say before I leave. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Victor. And Kevin, I can see you raising your hand. Um, Personally, I hear you. And the only way we can change what people's perceptions are is to speak about where we want the directions to be, rather than just being more antagonistic. I'm trying to use the right word, please. Pardon my friend. Rather than just being more aggressive and saying, "No, I don't trust you. You're not going to do this." How do we channel our energy towards getting this windfall tax is going to happen? I don't know when, but it's part of the um, Finance Act. How do we channel our energies towards directing government in ensuring that we can see the effects in the economy? Kevin, over to you. You heard what he said, and you've spoken about investor confidence. We've spoken about so many other things in terms of how we think this wealth can be redistributed. Orekelewa mentioned the fact that a lot of the production companies made losses. Should we just take the money and just put it back into them and things like that? But you can respond to that, and then I'll come back to Dr. D. Dr. D,
it's
I'll come
always
back to you once Kevin is done.
it's always good to speak from a position of data, and look at the numbers. Um, if you look at the windfall tax, you see that Fugaz, the top six banks, they booked $3.1 billion in unrealized gains. Out of the $3.1 billion, only about $200 million is realized. $2.9 billion is still floating. Yeah. If you look at their net balance sheets for FX onshore, 2.9 of that $3.1 billion is still floating. So what the government effectively can tax as windfall, 70%, is actually $200 million. That's what they can tax. And then you look at the non-speculative CRR that is currently 45%, one of the highest in the world, as a matter of fact. When Emefiele took over in 2014, CRR was 14%. The global recommended average for cash reserve ratio is actually 15%. Nigeria has it at 3 times. I don't need to go back to explain the story of CRR. CRR is basically like a tool the central bank uses to manage liquidity in the banking system and control money supply. Emefiele converted it to a tool to use to finance budget deficits for the government. In violation of Section 38. I don't want to go that angle. And so it means that for every 45%, every 45 kobo that is deposited into a Nigerian bank, these banks are obligated to keep 45% of that interest free with the Central Bank of Nigeria. That's what it means. You
Yeah,
look at
everyone the banks you keep 45 kobo.
exactly. You look at AMCON levy. AMCON should have been dissolved since 2021, 2022, based on the AMCON Act of 1 decade. AMCON is still charging fees to the banks. You look at deposit insurance premiums that the banks have to pay to NDIC, AMCON levy, and CRR. The banks are exposed $1.8 billion for 2023. So, the question about, revaluation gains, manufacturing companies, FX forwards, good arguments. But what are the numbers saying? The numbers are saying that for Fugaz, 6 top banks in Nigeria, $30.1 billion, 2.9 is unrealized. Only $200 million has been realized. Now, it's coming at the same time. Recapitalization. It's coming at the same time when the banks are doing recapitalization. I just needed to put that out there so that we see the numbers and see that it's not as rosy as we think it is. So my
Um,
guess is that the wage bill, that deficit that the government has that they need to finance, is 70% of $200 million going to fund it. And are the banks going to close their open positions of $2.9 billion? And all the madness the banks have to deal with, deposit insurance premium and then AMCON levy, which is a repetition, by the way. The AMCON levy and deposit insurance premium is a repetition. And the CRR of about 6 trillion naira plus that the banks have floating with the Central Bank of Nigeria that is not earning them any money in a market where and then NTB stop limit is between 24 and 26%. And in a market where you can see that the banks are struggling to close their IPO. I feel very bad and sorry for the security underwriters on those right vision,
okay.
because they're struggling to close their IPO. They're not getting the subscription because risk-free rates for government securities is over 20%. These are things we need to look at and put in perspective as we talk about how lucrative the FX revaluation gains are.
Thank you, Kevin. And let me come to you, Dr. D. Dr. D, you have something to say?
Yes,
We
I have
we
something to say.
we
Yeah.
we
So
we have actually gone deeper into some of the things that we're going to be talking about next week, which are the economic realities of the windfall tax. And I'm glad that we're using this town hall to bring them out so that next week we'll have a more detailed conversation around it. These sessions are going to run for the next about 9 to 10 weeks. So there are so many areas that we need to talk about. So let's go on.
Yes. So I had to jump in continuation, to the conversation from Dr. Victor, okay, because this will be a recurring concern with the public, and it has to do with the transparency of this windfall taxation, how it's going to be applied, because essentially this is going to be a one-off, gain, and so it's not going to be a sustainable policy, because this has to do with the currency devaluation that happened, and then you can draw a cue, from the recent announcement by the NNPC when they refused to use the word even subsidy to clarify to the public that the government was still paying subsidy because it will go against the position of the government last year when they said subsidy was gone. So the NNPC said that the cost of importing the petrol and the selling price was what they call importation shortfall. Those were the technical words because I work in policy as well, and when these are the things we spot out when we review bilateral programs and proposals like this. I say because we could use fancy words to try and hide, the true intention. Don't forget, the government has a very big bill to pay now. They have just negotiated a 70,000 new minimum wage, which was not even captured in the 2024 budget. And that money has to come from somewhere. Where are they going to get the money from? Are they going to fund it through the loan that they just got from the World Bank, or are they going to use this money? So we need to go on a roadshow on the town hall, like what you are doing now is a town hall, right? This is a town hall conversation. Let us adopt the same strategy that the former Minister of Finance and the coordinating Minister of the Economy under the Jonathan government, which was Ngozi Iweala, and the then Central Bank Governor Sanusi, when they engaged in town halls, they went across the country trying to engage robustly with the people to tell them why subsidy has to go, the rationale behind it, and how the government was going to cushion the effect too, all right? Because they were not just going to leave the people out to hang and dry. But this is why, I understand there's going to be mixed reaction. Some people were going to, or as usual, those that are in power today resisted then the policy. But I'm try to get this conversation going in the direction whereby let us push the government to engage with the public because this government lacks transparency already. In terms of how they're running things with the Lagos Calabar Highway, we don't even know how there's no bidding process. They said they were only using the invitation of who they wanted to, give it. So there's a lot of transparency issues already, a huge pile up of transparency issues with the government. So I think we should encourage the government to come out, sending the Minister for Finance, Wale Edun, the Governor of the Central Bank, Mr. Cardozo, and other maybe representatives to come in and engage. You could maybe go to Lagos, Abuja, Port Harcourt, or maybe seek geopolitical zone, and people will come in, experts, policy experts, leaders, community people, representative of youth, students, and all that. We engage them. How is the money going to be used? How do we have oversight? Because what makes people adopt policies and key into policies of government is when there is transparency and engagement. People bring in their ideas and there's a more greater oversight. And we have representation as well from the House of Reps, Senate, National Assembly, because this money was not even captured in the 2024 budget. So is the government going to borrow that money? Because I'm thinking they might borrow that money as a bill to pay their bills, right? And then try and say they'll refund it later. So that's the point I was trying to make. So let's try and see how we can have greater citizen engagement and responsibility in trying to make sure the government provides greater transparency and push the money into the direction which they told us they're going to push the money to, which is education, healthcare, infrastructure. And by the way, the budget for the healthcare was 1.3 trillion, which was only 4.8%, which is very dismal for a country like Nigeria with 200 million people with no healthcare insurance and all that. So I think the money needs to go to these critical areas of the sectors. Thank you. Over to you, Wade.
Thank you, Dr. D. Jab, I'll come to you, and I'm glad that Dr. D, you're speaking about having these town halls, and that's why Nairametrics is always number one in providing this kind of platforms for people to air their views and people to listen, and those who are listening to also air their views in terms of what the expectations are. Yes, and that's why we're doing this. So the government agencies can work with us and tell us whether they want a physical or a virtual session, and we can arrange that for them. And and it's really important that we continue to have this kind of discussions, because a number of people in the banking industry, in the general economy, have said, "Oh, the windfall tax is good. The government requires the money and so on." But Jab, let me have your feedback on this, because so many people have expressed their fears. You have also expressed your areas of concern in terms of where you think it should go to, in terms of and how you think it should go about it. But what are your fears, and how do you think this can be allayed?
Okay, thank you very much. So, firstly, I would like to say something regarding what Mr. Kelvin said. I slightly disagree with the concerns of Mr. Kelvin with the banks, those financial sector. So, talking about their IPO, Fidelity Bank was able to achieve their IPO. So, the fact that Zenith Bank had to extend their own by 2 weeks, I do still believe that it is something that would be very difficult for them to achieve. And secondly, and okay, let me just round that up. I think for those bank recapitalization, for the 2 years deadline, I think they should be able to achieve it. And then secondly, the banks, before the collapse of the exchange rate system that led to this profit that they've declared, either realized or unrealized, they've been making billions, hundreds of billions in profit after tax. Even before then, 2020, 2022, 2023, most of them were making hundreds of billions in profit. So the recapitalization was, so when it will come is where we didn't know. So it is here, and then I think that they should just put their heads together to figure that out. And then thirdly, I think for sorry, I'm diverting a little bit away from the windfall tax. I think the banks, the government really needs to look at the activities of the banks. I think they provide banking services rather than financial services. How many percentage of Nigeria can afford to go to banks and get loans to facilitate any of their activity? An average Nigerian cannot go to the bank to go and get a loan where you'll be paying almost 35 to 40% interest. So let's talk about housing loan, car loans, business loans. Small businesses cannot go to bank to go and get loan. These are the major core activities of bank, to provide financial services and activities for small businesses, not just big organizations where you just issue out. What they do majorly is just LC. They make LC payments, and that's where they are getting.
Yeah, but I'll need to interject you. That's a topic for another day, and it's a very, very diverse topic. But let's also remember that the fact that yes, these banks, they do provide financial services and financial advisory aside from just your regular banking of deposits and deposits and withdrawals, and also the amount of expenditure in terms of infrastructure collaborations that they do, the expansion of financial services and a number of that. But that's a discussion for another day, and I had to interject you there. Time is never really our friend, but I would like to throw this out to my three speakers who have joined us today, Orekelewa, Kelvin, and Dr. Yu, so that you can give us your closing beats. Um, Everybody, and like Kelvin explained, if you look at the Fugas, which are the top five tier one banks, potential $200 million in dollars in terms of FX revaluation gains realized, another 2.9 billion yet to be realized, and that was at the point at which exchange rate moves from about 460 to about 960 at the end of 2023, and then we're looking at exchange rate at 960 at the end of December 2023, and about 1,500, 1,600 um 2024. Do you see the windfall tax going on again in 2025? Because like you all are aware taxes are based on prior year. So do you see another windfall tax? Do you see the extension of this in 2024, in 2025? And if you do, and based on all the positions that have come out today and all the things that we're looking at, do you see it as an opportunity for the government to be more logical and sequential in the way they go about um, applying it, and applying it to the areas of the economy that is required? And that will be that I throw that question out so that you can help us close out on this session, and then we can move on. Thank you. So let me start with Orekelewa.
Sorry, I didn't catch all of the question, but I would say in terms of actually give me a second. Start with somebody else. I didn't catch all the question.
Hello, you didn't get the question. I said, okay, so what I was saying is that exchange rate 460 January 2023, 930 or 9 between 930 and 960 December 2023. So FX revaluation 100%. December 2023 and possibly December 2024, 1,600 to 960. So are we looking at another windfall tax against 2025? And if that be the case, do we say we should do that? But do we think that government can continue this? And what exactly should they do in ensuring that the windfall tax is actually revitalizing the economy? I hope you got that.
Yeah, I got it. I got it now. Thank you. All right. So, I mean, it's important to note that the oh, sorry, one second. It's important to know that windfall taxes. So, for example, World Bank advocates for a windfall tax on the energy sector as a permanent thing. So it's not something that's limited to just this year. However, I do think that there was a marked difference between the situation last year and the situation this year. So last year you had um, government policy which dramatically altered the terms of engagement in the foreign exchange market. Whereas this year we're working through some of the kinks in the system, if one might say it like that. In terms of trying to get a foreign exchange market that actually functions in an efficient way so that we can actually achieve a proper price equilibrium. I think we've got some more challenges on the way to that, but I do think it's important to kind of point out the difference between what happened last year and what happened this year. That being said, in terms of how the government can, going forward, ensure that the monies used are actually revitalizing the economy, you know, I think we need to be a bit more creative. And I'm really interested to see the concrete plans that the government has, if it has intentions of investing in specific sectors or specific areas of government. One of the really interesting things about the student loan program, for example, was the ability of the fund to invest in um, other things in order to generate more income and use that as a means of stabilizing the fund and being able to ensure its continuity and sustainability. I think we need to start thinking less about what we can pay for in cash. And I know Nigeria is a cash society, but what we can pay for in cash today, and start thinking more about how we structure our investments as a nation. I think that's really important point. Earlier, I talked about NSIA's Future Generations Fund, and if you think about some of the investments that NSIA has been making recently, you've got investments in the medical sector, which is happening in partnership with the private sector. So you've got quite a few PPPs, but crucially it's not involving, cash down, we built a hospital, right? And I think that's really that's the kind of mindset shift that I'm hoping to start seeing when you get bulk amounts of money for government, which are extraordinary revenues. The final thing that I would just say is that I think we're at a critical juncture, and as much as I, talked earlier about the need to be able to ensure the success of the reform program, I think what Nigeria really desperately needs, and I spoke about this last year, NOI spoke about this recently as well, is a rewriting of the social contract. And I think this is a really good opportunity for the government to really make the terms of it clear. If it is, you know, doing a Robin Hood tax, which is what it's framing the windfall tax as, to be really clear about the social gain that's going to come from the investments that it makes with that money. I do hope, independently of the windfall tax, that we next year, certainly in the government budget and towards the end of this year, start to see a bit more seriousness about meeting our international, at least our ECOWAS and African Union benchmarks in relation to health and educational human capital development. But I think also we need to kind of allow for the government to take a step back and think about how it can support the private sector to do other things, right? You know, we talked about agriculture. The cost of production in agriculture is so high, but much of that is about structural issues. And so I'd rather the government address that or tackle that on a policy level rather than kind of like throwing money at subsidizing. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Annie. Dr. You, over to you.
Oh, thank you. Wade. So it's been an interesting conversation. For me, maybe I'll just wrap it up by saying that for your question, if we would be expecting the windfall tax to continue into 2025, I mean, that would depend on a lot of conditions, right? Maybe you look at the policy of the government side, if the windfall tax is going to be put in place. We're going to see how the public will receive it, because already, like I said, the public is already welcoming the idea, but they want to see greater investments in those critical sectors, and the public perception will really underline the government's political will at the end of the day. If the people think the money is not going where it should go, it might, derail, the conversation, and public support might be eroded at the end of the day. So we'll also look at it from the angle of maybe foreign investment too. Maybe if the government look at it that the windfall tax has reduced uh, foreign investment in terms of banking sector, because if Nigeria wants to attract a lot of foreign capital, the policymakers will have to also gauge and see the reaction of this windfall tax in terms of the numbers. How much foreign investment have we lost, in terms of the banking sector? If it doesn't look good, maybe they might try to reform the tax, to make the investment environment more appealing. And maybe the last one I would look at would be the equity part of things. Income inequality and wealth redistribution. Uh, we have to assess if we have made gains, right, with this particular windfall tax that the government is going to, this tax bill that they're going to get. Have they been able to invest properly, social investment programs, try to lift people out of poverty, invest in education, like the student loan that Rick and White just said. That was one of the policies that suffered, kickoff delays because they didn't have more money. So I would expect, and in fact, I think it was the EFCC had to borrow 50, oh, sorry, not borrow, actually gave 50 billion naira to the executive secretary, to add to the project, which is for me is a commendable policy as well. So I think this money should actually be used to support other critical policies like that, because that's a part of education sector that the government said they were going to support, right? So we could see them putting this money more into that student loan program, see how they can help people, with this new economy that we are facing where everything has gone up, students need help. So I will see. I think this conversation will take more shape when we gauge how they have been successful in 2024. Then we will now see how we can support the policy, and also even the National Assembly might even think about either reducing it by next year if the windfall doesn't increase, or if they don't think, okay, you mentioned that the money increased from 900 and something to 1,006. So yeah, it's likely they might, but if it's not so successful, they might reduce the tax bill, right? From 70 to 50%. But I believe they increased to 70% because they thought that they could achieve a lot more by slapping a higher tax bill. So let's gauge the policy going forward for 2025, maybe sometime at the end of the year. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Yu. Kevin, over to you. Your final thoughts, and then we can
Thanks for
close out.
having me. Thank you, Nairametrics. And sincere apologies, I came in 30 minutes late to the session. In closing, I'm going to respond to what Jab, the speaker, said, and I'm going to bring us back. So, what's the reason behind the windfall tax, for example, in Nigeria? It's standard of living. The idea that 30,000 naira used to be about $200 10 years ago. 30,000 naira is now less than. And today, you won't get, I think it's like less than $50, if I'm not mistaken. Dollar today is about 1,640, you know, and inflation is 33 points. MPR is 26.85. The current hike in PMS is going to, raise inflation rates consistently, and we've had 22 months of consecutive increase before this first slowdown in July. So when you look at that and you look at what that speaker Jab said, you look at the fact that the central bank does not just raise MPR to apply to prime lending rates, and the commercial lending rate. They don't just raise it. They raise it because of what they call an inflation to interest yield curve. So if inflation comes down, if you can fix your exchange rate induced risk to inflation, and you can fix the food side, because if you look at the CPI basket, 52% of inflation is food, 17% is energy. If inflation begins to come down, MPRO will automatically be revised down because they're always trying to maintain a band, even if that band has been disproportionate over a period of time. And you look at the fact that there is not a flow of credit in the financial system in Nigeria. And then you consider that banks don't like giving consumer loans because most of those consumer loans are not collateralized. And then you also have the question of the fact that there is a lack of what I call big data infrastructure for banks to be able to do origination on loans in Nigeria, especially for loans that are not collateralized, backed by assets. And the NIN BVN linkage is an attempt, but Nigeria, the government needs to build like a central repository for big data infrastructure to enable banks to provide clean lines to customers. That's the only way you can see that they bridge the gap to provide credit, consumer credit, that the government is trying to do with credit corporation. I don't subscribe to all this idea of discounting loans. The government is saying they're going to give single digit, because there's nothing like single digit loans in the financial system. Anybody giving you 9% loan in a policy environment where MPR is 26.85 is paying it from his pocket. If the government is giving you that, they are paying it from their pocket some way or the other. So the goal is to get inflation down. If you get inflation down, everything is going to line up. If you get inflation down, you won't need to apply windfall tax. That's the point here. The cancer in any economy is inflation. That's the cancer. If you fix inflation, everything lines up automatically. And if you look at the fact that in that fiscal strategy paper in 2014, the DG of Budget Office migrated from revenue to debt. And you see that has plateaued from 16.8 to over 50%. You have debt to GDP ratio above fiscal responsibility limits. You see that the migration from revenue to debt, the interest on the debt that is, weighing down the government budget to fix what is supposed to fix, that is trying to use windfall tax to fix now, is what has brought us here. So fix inflation. And for you to fix inflation, you have to fix all these other factors of exchange rate. For you to fix exchange rate, you have to fix your balance of payment. Balance of payment comes from autonomous dependent sources for FX. I don't want to go into it because we don't have time, but it's a vicious cycle. But we have to come back to the center. And we have to come back to the beginning and look at it. Why was the windfall tax, brought up in the first place? The reason why it was brought up is because the standard of living has dropped, and standard of living dropped because inflation is perennially high, and it looks like we're in wartime.
Okay, thank you, everyone. It's been another interesting session, and thank you for all those who listened and all those who joined us in our town hall. Jab, World Speaker, sorry we couldn't. World Peace, sorry we couldn't bring you on. I like to thank all my speakers for today, Kelvin, Dr. Du, all my people at the back end. But tomorrow we have a special session that is going to focus on the um, down and midstream oil and gas sector, as we'll be talking about the Dangote refinery, supply dynamics, pricing dynamics for